Dr. Quan Ni, who's a neurotech innovator, has joined us for a conversation about translation and commercialization. Dr. Ni, the first question I have for you is, can you tell us a little bit about your career path?
Oh, thank you for the opportunity to be here. I started my education in biomedical engineering. I was a graduate from Jiaotong University in China, went to UC San Diego, getting bioengineering, and I graduated with a PhD in bioengineering University of Utah in cardiac electrophysiology, which brought me to my first job in a company in Twin Cities called Guidant. They actually are making cardiac pacemakers, ICDs, and cardiac resynchronization therapy. I stayed there for 8 years and then left there and then joined a startup in the Twin Cities. It's called Inspire Medical Systems. Has been with them for 13 years, and then it really has been a great journey as a biomedical engineer.
Can you tell us about the roles that you've had at Guidant, Boston Scientific, and Inspire Medical?
So I guess, we started our career as a scientist. So I joined Guidant as a senior scientist, moving to the management track, really because I love to do multiple projects. So we have a team of scientists. And then I was the senior manager when I left Boston Scientific in 2008, joined Inspire, and then really my tenure there, really running the research team and also the clinical team. So I left there as the vice president of the research and clinical affairs.
Based on the experiences that you've had at Inspire Medical, can you take us through the process that you had from early stage, developing a product all the way to market adoption?
Yeah. Matt, I think maybe the example with Inspire is actually a good example to illustrate, as a biomedical engineer, the involvement in the different stage of bringing a new therapy into the marketplace. So Inspire actually started in 2007. This is really tackle a major problem in managing people with obstructive sleep apnea. It's a condition that affecting close to about 15% adult Americans. Generally, people are really tired when they have moderate to severe sleep apnea, and then they have an impact in their productivity. And also, there's also evidence with cardiovascular disease once you have untreated obstructive sleep apnea. One of the main reasons for people with untreated OSA is because they cannot adhere to the current standard of care. This is the continuous positive airway pressure of CPAP. Close about 60% of people actually may not necessarily getting adequate treatment from CPAP. So that really is the opportunity that we had when we started Inspire. So the company really getting the venture capital support as the company spun off from Medtronic. And then I joined the company as the first scientist. I think at the time there's a CEO and then we have another engineer. So it was really a fairly small team, but we got this, pretty grand ideas that somehow we believe there's actually possibility be able to use neuromodulation technology to treat obstructive sleep apnea. So the company going through early stage, once we have the device ready, has done a series of feasibility studies. So this is, I guess, the first stage, which is really the clinical stage of a startup medtech. So getting data to understand, do we actually see a benefit? So you can looking at the early safety and also getting the early idea, would patient actually responding to the neuromodulation therapy for treating obstructive sleep apnea. Once we have some encouraging results from the early feasibility study, then we begin to work with FDA and really think about, are we able to really demonstrate with clinical evidence that can supporting both safety and efficacy. So by that time, the team grew really with regulatory affair, with quality systems, and also getting ready with the pivotal trial. This is the phase 3 trial that used in the industry. And then we go into this regulatory stage of the company, really kind of try to demonstrate there's a convinced evidence that the FDA and also other international regulatory body be able to accept. So we conduct the feasibility trial and then the pivotal trial with about 127 patients. And then luckily, we actually see really encouraging results. And the work actually got published on the New England Journal of Medicine. Really was actually strong support for the quality of the clinical trials. which actually really paved a really strong foundation to be able to convince the FDA panel review for getting the approval, which was occurred in 2014. So that first 6 years, I think, is actually kind of really shows some of the classic stage of a new therapy, which is the clinical stage and then the regulatory stage. After the FDA approval, the company continued to expand. We actually receive additional funding, and this is really the stage that we want to go into the next hurdle for a medtech company, which is getting the reimbursement. As you know, a lot of the medical device therapy, the insurance coverage is a major step for getting therapy adoption. So in this case, once again, the company really going through a series of investment in building additional clinical evidence. In the same time, we begin to also getting individual patient experience really support that some of the early work we have done in the clinical stage, regulatory stage, that we can translate into clinical practice. When we're getting the same outcome approved by the FDA in the clinical practice, that actually gives insurance company a lot of confidence that they can provide coverage for patients. So from 2014 to 2018, we really begin to accumulate the evidence with reimbursement and then begin to receive insurance coverage policies in the 2016-17 timeframe. And then the company with those great news will actually also went public in 2018, getting additional funding. So that actually brought maybe after the reimbursement stage into this commercialization stage that we really began to expanding on the distribution team, really have a lot of sales support and also training support for the physicians be able to establish new program to really bring the therapy to their patients. So I guess in summary, here are the main stage. In the clinical stage, getting clinical evidence, and then in the regulatory stage, in getting FDA approval, and then in the reimbursement stage, in getting confidence from payers in providing coverage, and then in the commercial stage that help doctors to bring the therapy into their patients.
I know one of the challenges that early stage companies oftentimes face is running preclinical studies without sort of the in-house infrastructure to carry those out. Can you tell us about some of the experiences that you've had in that area?
Yeah, so Matt, you brought up a great point. I think for the scientists on the team, you actually started with the preclinical stage. So I have experience working in a large company, Boston Scientific, which actually has their own preclinical facilities. There's staff on the team that can really collaborate. For a lot of the startups, we really end up actually working with the professional CROs. There's actually a number of CROs really focus on preclinical models. So they also have a lot of expertise with animal model has already been established. So that actually is very important for the medtech industry, that there's a very strong support in the preclinical science. In the Twin City area, there's some great CROs. I think this is one of the fortune in be working in a location that there's just such a long history in new therapy development, including the preclinical science.
I'd like to ask a little bit more about the clinical trials that you talked about with Inspire Medical. So you had an early feasibility study, and then you had a pivotal trial. Were there other studies that you conducted kind of in between before moving to that pivotal trial?
So Matt, you're asking a good questions. The evolution from early feasibility to the pivotal trial. So what are the main challenges in that stage? So I had the fortune that, or misfortune that we run 2 feasibility studies, right? Really shows that we actually learned something in the first one, and we have to really do a second one. And then from second one to the pivotal trial. So some of the typical questions I think faced with, this is, I think, very much actually the learning from the cardiac resynchronization therapy. I also had the fortune to learn from some of the greatest scientists I met in Boston Scientific. So typically for cardiac stimulation or neurostimulation, there's a few really common issues we deal with. Number one is really finding the patient population. So this has the implication for the pivotal trial in the patient selection for your clinical trial. In this case, that the understanding of the disease mechanism can really help you to identify which patient group are most likely to benefit from therapy. So in the case of hypoglossal nerve stim, you have the patient that has a different severity of OSA. In this case, it's actually pretty natural. We tend to focus on patients with moderate to severe disease because it's an implantable therapy. People argue that if you have mild disease, you might try less invasive therapies, right? So that actually really dominated patient selection there. In terms of therapy response, there's also other mechanisms. In this case, we identified that the hypoglossal nerve is primarily moving the tongue base, but there's other level of the airway potentially can also block in the airway. So identify patient that the other part of the airway may not responding to hypoglossal nerve becomes very important early on in the patient selection criteria. So we did 2 feasibility studies primarily figure that out. We actually developed a screening technique in the first feasibility studies, identify patient that actually has a retropalatal collapse. This is in the other parts of the airway, also close, may not necessarily responding with the hypoglossal nerve. And then implementing that perspective in the second feasibility study, confirm the data and also give us some confidence using the same criteria going to the pivotal trial. So that really is just one of the example of some of the key elements of looking for evolution from feasibility to your pivotal trial.
And as part of putting together these clinical trials, did you work with a CRO to sort of design some of the trials, or was that sort of someone in-house that you brought into the company?
It really is all of the above. I think, Matt, by definition, startup are really lean. This is really, I think, the characteristic of the startup. Typically the internal team is small, but we really try to leverage consulting services. So, for example, in the clinical trial design, also there's a great service around the region that we can really get in biostatistical assistance, and also there's trial design experts, and also there's also people really familiar with the regulatory process. What kind of trial design will be relevant with the regulatory conversation with FDAs. So generally, internally, the team has the ability to be able to coordinate all those different efforts, but not necessarily being an expert, but to be able to really bring the service you need in really coming in with your own plan and then communicating that succinctly with the regulatory body.
Could you take us through the reimbursement strategy that you had with Inspire Medical? Was it initially thinking about gaining reimbursement through CMS, or did you target private payers with your company?
Yeah, I think it's a complex question.
Yeah.
I think I'm really, in this case, more of an observer, actually really assist the process with bringing the clinical evidence. So the conversation really is happening in parallel almost with all major players, including CMS, biggest insurer in the country, and also some of the largest private insurance companies like United Health, Aetna, Cigna, all the major players. So in reimbursement overall, there's generally 3 aspects. There's really, do you have the CPT codes, right? So there's regulations about the coding aspect, and then what's the payment with that code? So those are all relevant to the therapy development. But you really talk about the most important aspect is what is the data to give insurance companies confidence that the therapy is cost effective, and also it's providing the medically necessary therapy for patient. So in that particular area, that I think there's a couple of things that I think is common working with different payers. One is they are independent health technology assessment. So those, I think, has actually become a pretty important body to really pay attention to what has been their health assessment so far with the evidence today, and then what additional evidence that we need to continue to build. So there's actually several important health technology assessment. And then in the meantime, also continue to have dialogue with individual insurance companies. I was actually able to sit into some of the conversations, really working with doctors in presenting what are the clinical evidence we have today in supporting coverage. So that actually really happens at the individual insurers level, in working with their medical advisory team, be able to assisting them in understanding the clinical evidence we have.
As an engineer scientist working on hypoglossal nerve stimulation, what are some of the engineering challenges that you faced along the pathway of developing this technology?
Right. I think this is a kind of going back to the different role we all play in the startups. So my role was primarily really as the clinical scientist on the team. So there's a couple of things I think is really important. I mentioned one of them is in the patient selection, right? So how do we really design a clinical study so we're getting better confidence in the patient selection from understanding of disease mechanism. The second one, I think this is also, you're going to see that in several clinical applications of neuromodulation, is look at the nerve tissue interface, right? So this is, I think, primarily for the neuromodulation is look at what are the different nerves you're recruiting as you apply electricity. For the hypoglossal nerve, one of the things that is, Dr. Johnson, we have collaborated on this, that it's really important to understand, are you recruiting the retractor muscles of the tongue, or are you recruiting the protruser muscle of the tongue? This has a huge impact in being able to control the tongue in a way that you can really generating the end results, which is a forward motion of the tongue base, be able to really expanding the airway. So that I think there's a lot of details in using modeling, also kind of coming from using clinical research, be able to identify the locations along the hypoglossal nerve, be able to deliver therapy that with your intended mechanism of action, which is to recruiting the protruser muscle of the tongue.
Where do you see the technology, the hypoglossal nerve stimulation technology, going in the future?
So Matt, this is, I think, is what's really exciting about, when there is early success from one team, then there's a lot of interest from multiple teams, right? I think it's, so to me, there's really area of, so currently there's limitations of a patient can benefit, right? So mild to moderate to severe sleep apnea. And also I mentioned earlier, there's also limitations in terms of BMI in patients and also the different levels of airway. I think there's going to be really room to improve in terms of being able to expand therapy in patients that are currently not able to receive therapy. Right? So that I think is one direction that going to take additional clinical science in understand, are we able to really deliver either something else in addition to hypoglossal nerve, be able to expand the patient population can benefit. I think the hypoglossal nerve is a great nerve target, but potentially there's other nerve target actually can be in conjunction with hypoglossal nerve. So expanding the indication. The second part, I think, is really improve the patient experience itself. So currently, the device procedure, I think there's still rooms be able to improve from the current generation. I think that since the therapy introduction, there are already improvement in implant techniques. So that I think is going to continue to evolve. So hopefully this procedure can be less invasive, and then also when patients using the therapy, they can also have a much better time in their individual experience with the therapy. And then the third part is actually really help with physicians. As we know that today, they are hurdles for the physicians in managing patients once they receive the implant. And they actually have to come back to see doctors on a regular basis. Sometimes the device needs to be adjusted or fine-tuned. So are we really able to use additional technologies, including some digital health approach to be able to gather data? So some of the issues can be identified early, and then actually preventing some of the challenges once the patient facing for the doctors to be able to managing those easier and earlier.
And finally, can you tell us a little bit about your perspective on the future of neurotechnology? What are some interesting technology and interesting application areas in the field?
Certainly, this has a lot of personal perspective, as you can imagine, right? I think there's a lot of great work actually come from the academic setting. I think this really, some of the foundations coming from, understanding basic research, the new disease target, and also the new neurotechnologies. I think I see a lot of really progress made, with the work actually from the University of Minnesota and then many other places. I think from the industry side, there's continue to try to identify new clinical applications with neuromodulation. There's still very healthy ecosystem for startups in going after some of the targets. In big area in terms of technology, I think the first generation of neuromodulation therapy, right? So you got spinal cord stimulation, deep brain stimulation. There's also a lot of opportunities to be able to use technologies currently you can get access at home, be able to really help physicians in managing those therapies once the implant is completed. I see that in hypoglossal nerve stim, but you can also see that really begin to taking presence in deep brain stimulation, in spinal cord stimulation. So how do we really improve the patient experience post-implant? There's a lot of opportunity in that, in combining sensing technologies, in combining machine learning approach to be able to optimize patient experience. The other, I think, major area there's also, I really see great promise is the nerve tissue interface. We're now really starting to see emerging of a less invasive system and also really deeply miniaturized system be able to be more precise in terms of neuron recruitment. So there, I think is actually going to bring some new opportunities for many different existing applications, and also some of the, I think, great challenges we're still facing that actually can be helpful with the neuromodulation.
Thank you, Dr. Ni, for joining us today. Thank you for your time, your perspective, and your insight in the field of translation and commercialization of neurotechnology. We really appreciate it.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Dr. Johnson, for giving me this opportunity.